Is it a good job being a bouncer?
No. I was bouncing downtown Vancouver. I ended up getting injured one time. It wasn't the sucker punch that injured me. It was the fall on my leg. While I was immobile, I basically started writing blog articles.
So basically getting punched in the face launched a $100 million empire.
Like, oh my God, could you think of something more absurd?
Well, dude, I'm so glad we could do this in person. This is awesome. We're both in Vancouver, both Canadian. Appreciate you doing this.
Thanks for having me.
How's your day going? What have you been doing today?
Basically woke up and came here. So haven't done a whole lot yet.
And you're if I understand it, you are a night owl still.
Yeah, brutal one.
You go to bed at like what time?
It depends. But it is typically, I would say on an average day, 3 a.m. to 5 a.m.
That's where I used to be. And then I had kids.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And when it's PST as well, and you have businesses that operate in EST.
Yeah.
Brutal.
I used to wake up. I used to go to bed at 5, and at 4 a.m. I'd drive to a Subway. There's a 24-hour Subway. I'd eat Subway right before bed, and then I'd sleep in until 2 or 3 in the winter. The sun would set right as I was waking up, and I'd get like 45 minutes of sun. And now I'm a morning person because of kids. And if you have kids, I'm sure you will be too. But it's kind of a nice life. Like no one bugs you. What do you do at night? Like, what do you do with all that time?
All the stuff that is difficult to focus on in the day when your phone is exploding, essentially. So I'm sure you could attest to the fact that you can pretty much spur work out of thin air just by you respond to one thing, it equals an answer. So even though you've responded to things, you're actually just like spurring further threads of the same existing, problem potentially. It's not always solving it. Sometimes you're just initiating more back and forth. And oftentimes the day gets burnt up just by nature of answering all that stuff in business hours because those people are then on point to answer you back. And before you know it, you haven't got anything new done. You're just kind of addressing micromanage surface level tedious tasks that you probably shouldn't be touching. And, often it's pretty difficult to get removed off of everything you shouldn't be notified on notifications wise, but you see stuff popping up all the time in, Slack, Asana, ClickUp, whatever it is that you're using. And it's pretty hard to not jump in and restrain and just let it be. And oftentimes I'll just burn the entire day overseeing it, micromanaging, seeing what people are commenting on posts, especially if I'm daily posting. That's really difficult to get away from is the response to today's video. You'll find yourself jumping back in to get either a dopamine hit from the views climbing or just general feedback and see what the comments are like for, your own insights to improve or whatever, just because you're generally interested when you post stuff to see how people respond. But at nighttime, everyone's asleep. You can actually focus on new stuff is what I find with no interruption. It's like the real airplane mode.
You've done a really interesting thing. So you've built this huge audience. You have how many followers? 2 million or something on YouTube and
yeah.
Across everything. How big is it?
I'm sure there's overlap, but it's a few million-ish.
Yeah. So you've built this huge following, and unlike most influencers, you've actually built your own businesses, which probably adds to your stress load and all this stuff that you're doing. Can you talk a little bit about what those businesses are? And then I know you have business partners. How do you operate the whole thing? Like you're still deeply involved in it, obviously. But yeah, how does it work?
My primary 3 businesses are Gorilla Mind, which is a dietary supplements company and energy drinks, primarily focusing on sports nutrition and cognitive enhancing nootropics, essentially. They could get more granular, but that's probably a high level on it. Merrick Health, which is a telemedicine company focused on concierge level preventative medicine, getting access to high quality medical providers to interpret really elaborate, insightful diagnostics to determine, either how to proactively avoid, getting sick, disease, whatever, or to optimize your current state. And then the third business is more of like a miscellaneous, but it is getting more directional now, called Intelligent and Intelligent.shop. It's started with men's hair loss prevention products in particular, because that is a niche that I'm really interested in the science of and have published a lot of content on. And I'm kind of one of the forefront, faces of that content category online, I suppose. And then it's segregated also into fragrances, men's fragrances, as well as skincare. So it's more like a men's self-care line, I suppose. And yeah, so it's like essentially supplements, RTDs, meal replacements, protein drinks, etc., stuff like that for Gorilla Mind, Telemed, Merrick Health, and then men's self-care, hair loss, fragrance, skincare.
And you also make money from advertising on the YouTube channel as well. And how big is this whole empire?
I don't know. Like, how would you define how?
Well, like revenue, how big is it? Like 100 mil, bigger, smaller?
I think cumulatively, I'm pretty comfortable with just saying it's 9 figures plus cumulatively. Was that 100 million?
So you're how many years in now?
And that's gross, by the way.
Yeah.
I don't keep.
Sure. How many years in are you now to doing this?
8, I guess.
Crazy. And so where were you 8 years ago?
Just was bouncing downtown Vancouver and finished my undergrad in marketing, which is totally useless, by the way, but besides the point. Trying to figure out what I wanted to do. Essentially, I was bouncing downtown and, thought I would go get a job downtown Vancouver as an accountant, or I suppose a marketer for some, company. I really had no conception of what I was going to do. I just knew that it was something in the business realm, and I had entrepreneurial tendencies, but it certainly was not something I had a blueprint to follow. And I typically work best with concrete plans of do step 1 to equal step 2 to get to step 3. And without that, it was kind of like, well, I'm just going to go work for some company because that's what you're supposed to do, I suppose. And when I was bouncing downtown, sometimes you get in fights with patrons and whatnot. And I ended up getting injured one time.
What happened?
So basically, it wasn't the sucker punch that injured me. It was the fall on my leg that was kind of weird, without getting too granular on like the whole situation, breaking it down for 10 minutes. Basically, I fell down and my leg I don't know what it is about this leg, but it developed like an internal bleeding of sorts, and it just swelled up like crazy. And I was basically unable to return to work until it had kind of like drained itself. So, and it was not caused by, I've had this happen back when I was bodybuilding from an injection that went awry, but that was like, 5 years prior or something. So while I was immobile, I basically started writing blog articles. So I started writing about men's fitness.
So basically getting punched in the face launched $100 million empire.
Yeah.
That's crazy.
Technically.
What a weird thing. Did you feel pretty sorry for yourself when that happened?
Not really, because it's kind of part of the job. Sometimes you get.
Is it a good job being a bouncer?
No. Well, I guess it depends.
So you got good stories, I'm assuming?
Yeah. It was definitely fun while I was doing it sometimes, but you're often on call too. And, even on, Christmas, sometimes it'll be people want to go to the bar and they decide to open up and somebody needs to come down, and you might be the guy who you get time and a half, but I mean, you're still there on Christmas. So, it was good though for somebody who, at least at the time, wanted that experience and a job. It kind of checked 2 boxes, because I was never a partier necessarily, but I liked the concept of immersing myself in that world and kind of being in it in a way that I could justify as useful of my time, rather than just being like a degenerate, which is what I thought it would be if I went on my own time excessively downtown to, hang out in clubs and stuff. It just didn't feel worthwhile. It's just like a fun job.
Good way to meet girls.
Yeah. And you also meet a lot of like-minded guys who are into the same stuff as you if you're a fitness bro. So
you get punched in the face, you're out for a bit, and then how do you start the business, or how do you start posting online? How does it all happen?
So I guess fortunately, WordPress blogs were not such a high barrier to entry that it was, somebody totally inept to, how you would start a business is still capable of starting one. So I was able to spin up what otherwise looked like a horrendous site, but functioned, and I could write articles. And I had seen one of my current business partners develop an online persona. At the time, he was probably one of the front facing influencers of, the pickup community or self-improvement community as a whole. Realistically, I think he had 40,000 something subscribers, which at the time in 2015, 2016 was like, you're the shit, like that's a big following. So like I would say the proportional of that now is probably like with inflation, subscriber inflation, it's like 400,000 to a million or something. So anyway, he was super influential on me using a framework of he did this from scratch, just writing content, becoming an affiliate for stuff that he'd recommend, making commissions off of it, developing an audience, and kind of looking at how he did it was a big inspiration and blueprint for me to get started, because I don't think I would have otherwise, because I just couldn't wrap my head around how you could get from A to B and I didn't even know if I wanted to do that. I just kind of started writing.
What was your first piece of content?
The first article I wrote was how to bulk without getting fat, part 1 specifically. So I did a part 2 after, but yeah, it was basically just the standard fitness bro questions. How much protein should I have? What calorie surplus should I eat?
What year was this?
2016.
That was already, it's so interesting because like at that time I would think there's probably tons of websites that say this. You're not doing anything new, and yet you still somehow managed to build this huge following and niche. Like, what were you doing anything different than everyone else?
Well, I think the perception that it was saturated was probably not as real as it is now. So now super saturated. Whereas back then, you could still get millions of views on a basic, here's what I do a tricep extension video or something. So to me, it was not, I don't know, it still felt like there was room for more people that had some value to impart. And I also knew that I knew things outside of just the basics, like pharmacology. I was getting very into human biology, blood work interpretation, like all the stuff that became interested in. Some people follow my channel for now. It was different than what was available online, and no one was talking about it at the time. But to that same point, you need to talk about the basics too. How do I eat? How do I train? How do I whatever? So that was kind of where I started. But yeah, like there was certainly a case to be made that why would you be doing this? Because there's so many people talking about this already. But I mean, like, I don't know. There's a ton of stuff that's just replicated over and over again, I suppose, that doesn't end up being redundant, even though you see it and you objectively think like, oh my God, hasn't this been beaten to death by now? But I guess not.
So I became aware of you because I'm one of these guys who's an ectomorph and I can't put on muscle. So I went on YouTube and I started searching and how to bulk without part 1, which I found, and I started watching you a little bit, but I thought you were some random guy. And then I feel like a week later I saw you on Rogan. How the fuck did you go from some bouncer randomly writing articles to being on Joe Rogan? Like, that was not that long that was what, 4 years, 5 years?
Yeah. I think he messaged me in 2020 or maybe January 21. For me, I think the big pivot, or I guess like trajectory change for me, was when I started talking about transparency around hormone use and celebrity, actors and whatnot. And this is something that was swept under the rug brutally, to where, every actor would, come out and say, oh, I gained 30 pounds of muscle in 8 weeks because I just trained twice a day, or I ate more chicken or whatever. And no one was calling out, or at least very few people were calling out the fact that they're often lying. And I guess at the time it was kind of seen as a ballsy thing to call out, I suppose. At the time, you didn't know if you were going to get like sued, assassinated, who knows? So at the time, it was sort of a revolutionary concept to be calling this stuff out, even though people would suspect it. It was actually not as common. A lot of people like to say, how could you not know X person is enhanced or whatever? But most people actually don't know. A lot of people will see The Rock and believe him, and he says he's, just worked hard.
Why do you think it's a shameful thing for so many of these actors to admit that they take anabolics or doing extra stuff?
It depends on the context. because I don't think it's always shameful. I think sometimes it's actually a net negative to be influencing young people to be taking hormones when they are, maybe still in adolescence, because sometimes people will aspire to be like fill in the blank person, see their crazy physique, hear that they use steroids to get it, and then their conclusion is, I need to use steroids to look like that. So I could see the argument against it. But oftentimes they will either dance around it, but also in the context of there being monetary incentive to lie about it, which is where it gets more finicky, where you're selling a service.
Like Chris Hemsworth has that app of here's how I got fit, but really he's probably taking a bunch of other stuff as well to get the Greek god physique.
Yeah. And obviously there's nuance to that, because as you would know, as a business owner, you can't monitor every piece of content that comes out under you. So it's certainly possible people are representing the stuff he is putting out as, this is how I got Thor physique or whatever, but ultimately it's under his purview and you're responsible for it, I suppose. So there are examples of celebrities you could point to where, there's certainly obvious monetary upside to keeping it a secret and also capitalizing on it financially. And I think it goes without saying that The Rock, would he be as popular as he is if he looked like he did in his 20s? No. Let's be honest. Like, he would not be The Rock. So the guy's entire career is built off steroids, essentially.
Was there a moment where you
not the talent, but the physique?
Sure. Was there a moment where you called out one of those people and it just went crazy viral? And that, like, did Rogan catch on to you because you did that little analysis about his little belly, the gorilla belly thing or whatever it is?
No, the first time I think he caught on to my stuff was he had on a MMA commentator named Luke Thomas. And I still remember when he mentioned me on his episode of Joe Rogan podcast, and it was like wild.
Where were you when that happened?
I don't know, probably sitting at my desk like every day, I suppose. I don't remember, but to me it was crazy. And I just remember, wow, I'm getting mentioned on, Joe Rogan's podcast. Wild. That was the first time I was brought up, and probably that he was made aware of me. And then shortly thereafter, I had done some analysis videos on MMA fighters in particular, in terms of how you would be able to circumvent what was at the time often seen as bulletproof testing. So it wasn't as much the celebrity stuff, although I'm sure it came across his radar potentially. And it wasn't my fitness, how to bulk videos or whatever. It was the breakdowns of USADA, WADA, banned substance list, how to skirt around it, how athletes are cheating and not getting caught. Breaking that down is like even more granular of a subject that nobody was at least talking about on YouTube at the time at the level of detail that I was putting out. I believe. I could be wrong on that.
Do you believe that most athletes and most MMA fighters are doping and taking stuff?
No, I don't think most. It definitely depends on the sport, the governing body, because again, the scrutiny on the testing differs. So certain professional sports actually have far more lenient standards when it comes to like passing their, testing, and they often get less scrutiny in some sports too, because it's not as egregious to be caught doping, I suppose, because it just, to the public, it doesn't seem as much of a reason for, I don't know, it's not as problematic in the sport of question. Like if you're talking about MMA, it's people trying to kill each other in a ring, essentially. So you would imagine the most scrutiny gets put on somebody using drugs to cheat to then impart more damage on their opponent. Like that's one of the worst, most egregious ways you could be cheating. Whereas for basketball or something, if you're trying to like injury proof yourself or rehabilitate or, increase your bone integrity, that kind of stuff is not seen as bad as trying to kick somebody in the head harder. So, there's a differing perspective on that. But yeah, I would say there's at least more awareness now to the fact that it's not as clean as people probably thought. And if there's testing in a sport, it does not mean that because somebody passed the test that they're clean.
So 2020 hits, you hear yourself mentioned on Rogan, and then he messages you to come on. When was that?
I think it might have been January 21. And because of, I don't even know if this would get demonetized if I said it, but like C-19 stuff, then it was pretty problematic to travel, as I'm sure you could attest to being a Canadian. It was brutal. So I couldn't actually go when he invited me. So I ended up going at the end of the year. And the kind of like goal-oriented entrepreneur side of me, I basically said I wasn't going to go on until I hit 1 million. So I actually waited until I hit 1 million subscribers, and then I like timed it to go on the podcast. So to me, that was kind of like my reward for hitting it by the end of the year, I suppose. And yeah, it was cool.
So you went from, bouncer, and you're writing these blog posts, kind of basic fitness stuff. You get into much more detailed analysis of WADA and doping and calling people out and all that kind of stuff. How's the channel evolved, and what you like to actually talk about? How's it changed over the last 3 or 4 years?
There's far less basic content for sure when it comes to how much protein should I eat, how much of a calorie deficit should I eat, and top 10 tips for cutting, like that kind of stuff I don't really do anymore. Not that I think that's bad. And if anything, maybe it would be favorable for me to do some of that stuff because it's highly searched topics, but it has transitioned more towards preventative medicine, longevity, vitality, interpreting diagnostics, more so than the science of performance enhancement.
So how has your own priorities, how have your own priorities changed when it comes to health, 10 years ago versus today? You were taking a whole bunch of anabolics and stuff. Now, what does that look like compared to where you were at 10 years ago?
So 10 years ago, I would have been trying to get as jacked as humanly possible, and very little regard for, or at least at the time, an increasing awareness around the potential risks, but essentially disregarding them because of, I suppose, at a young age, you're pretty resilient and you get away with a lot of stuff, but also just not being aware of the, risk, the gravity of the risks. Because at the time, social media, because it wasn't as big as it is now, there was not as much reporting of people dying at a young age too from using this stuff. So literally 10 years ago, you would hear, this was a common phrase, where are the bodies? And people would talk about how there's no evidence that steroids are killing people, when the reality is it's insidiously like shortening your life dramatically. And when you die, you could argue that you had, a heart condition, genetically predisposed or whatever, or it was this or it was that. But ultimately, like, it's not normal, even if you're genetically predisposed to be dying, typically at like 27 years old, because you had unregulated high blood pressure for, 6+ years, or, your heart's twice the size it should be or something.
You mentioned in other podcasts, I've heard you talk about how you still do TRT, some of that stuff. Do you think that now today, is that just pushing yourself to a kind of a baseline, or are you still trying to enhance your body or do anything? Like, are you basically off everything now?
No, so I'm on a physiologic replacement amount, which can be a bit of a cop-out for optimization for some people, because it's like almost TRT is the new like fake natty for some people, essentially. Because it's like, oh, I'm not actually doing anything. But in reality, the baseline state you've imposed is exogenous, as in externally administered, and not representative of what you could sustain with natural function, because it's not going to perpetually stay at that level, because you have a natural diurnal rhythm when you pulse out testosterone. It's not like it just stays at the exact level that you've administered. It, pushes out and pulses, and it will dip as well if you have bad sleep, if you drink, if you have poor diet or whatever. Like, you will see the reflection of that in the testosterone levels going up and down. And even if you were perfect on everything, they don't just stay at the same level. Whereas somebody who's injecting, it will just stay at that level. And they have, despite on paper the same testosterone, they will have more muscle and performance than the same alternative scenario with their natural testosterone level at that level.
If you're just doing TRT and you're maintaining a baseline, you're not burning the candle. But as soon as you start adding anabolics to that, ranging from Anavar to the, the much more intense stuff, there's a cost to everything. Is that correct?
Yeah, but there is definitely, like, people are still going to die at some age, regardless if they're natural or enhanced. And to say that you could take TRT generally with no consequence would be very misleading in my opinion, because there's a spectrum of what TRT is. Again, like I had mentioned, with your testosterone range naturally on paper, a guy who has 1100 total testosterone with synthetic administration, they could argue I'm just on TRT because it's physiologic, versus if they were at 600 or something, it's also TRT because it's physiologic. If I'm at 400, it's also like, it's all TRT within that range essentially by traditional standards. But it doesn't mean that you can sustain that high normal level and not have any consequence guaranteed just because it's normal on paper. Because again, it's a sustained level perpetually. It doesn't dip. You know, there's some risks that I wouldn't say are guaranteed to make it dangerous, but there's certainly a case to be made where it's not just TRT equals safe. And all the literature we have is using like androgel and pushing your test up like 300 from 200 to like 500 or something. It's not using injectable testosterone to maintain 1,000 nanograms for your entire life. Like there's no literature on that.
If you could go back 10 years, would you tell yourself not to take anabolics?
No, I would have done everything I did because it led me to where I am now, which I think is a pretty standard answer for somebody who's like relatively content with their situation.
Well, let's say you had a son. Let's say you had a son. Your son's 22 and he wants to get ripped, or you have a buddy who wants to get ripped. What would you tell them?
Oh, I would say put in enough years naturally that you've plateaued to where there's no perceivable, or at least you're just eking out incremental progress year over year via optimized diet, training, sleep hygiene, etc. At that point, if you want to be competitive on a stage, or you just really want to take the risk, because no judgment, if somebody just wants to take stuff, I don't think they should have to be competing to, enhance or, optimize. Because again, it's a spectrum. It's not like we're talking about the same situation where somebody is pushing their testosterone from 500 to 1200 doesn't mean it's not the same as somebody pushing it from 500 to 3000. Like obviously there's going to be increased risk as you elevate the exposure to some extent, and it's individual dependent on where the risk to reward is. And I certainly don't want to act like I have a general framework that everyone should follow. So in what I would say though, that's a framework that I think people should follow, is maximize what you can naturally, and then learn as much as you can during that time frame about how your hormones work, how to interpret labs, how you would go about a intelligently thought out course if you were to use it. And only once you're thoroughly educated on it and you actually understand how the HPTA works, which is your hypothalamus pituitary testicular axis, until you actually understand how the drugs are affecting you and how you would recover and how you would offset risk, I would not be touching it. So partly it's about maximizing natural potential, but a lot of that too is giving yourself a time frame that you can actually learn to understand what you're exposing yourself to.
So if someone sees like Brad Pitt or Chris Hemsworth or whatever, and they look incredible and they are, they want to go natural, is that achievable, or is that basically impossible unless you're a genetic freak?
I would certainly not classify Brad Pitt as a genetic freak, aside from
very nice face.
Yeah. So the genetic freaking like visual, cosmetically, but like actual physique, muscle building potential wise, I think he was like probably 160, 170 pounds in Fight Club, which is the physique a lot of people point to. Maybe he's like 5 to 10 pounds heavier in Troy, which is like the pinnacle maybe of Brad's, physique history. And a lot of this stuff is literally peaking for one moment in time that is not sustainable even for them. So, there's a lot of celebrities that attest to the fact that when they are on camera, it was a synthetically produced situation that they, water depleted for, had perfect lighting. A lot of things were created that are not a sustainable thing that they would even be able to themselves maintain that long term, let alone somebody trying to aspire to be them without their genetics. And I'm not to say that you couldn't, with relatively average or above average genetics, get to there either naturally, it depends on the person. If we're talking about The Rock, it's pretty blatant that you're probably not going to get there naturally. With a guy like, Brad Pitt in Fight Club, like, he wasn't that big. So I think it's reasonable that a lot of people could get there naturally. The way it looks, though, once you actually get that body comp, if you have a DEXA scan and it shows a certain lean body mass, it's not going to necessarily look the same in the mirror is the problem. So you might see 160-pound Brad Pitt shredded and be like, he's way more jacked than me, but it's just because your muscle inserts and the way you are created just doesn't look as good at that body fat percentage.
So you've called out a couple specific people, and I love this stuff. I love it when, I think everyone psychologically loves it when somebody goes out and trumpets themselves and then they trip and fall in the mud, right? So you called out Logan Paul and Liver King specifically. What is it about doing that you enjoy?
I suppose it's being able to bring awareness to something that people are getting duped on, essentially. So I don't like the idea of misleading the masses with like absurd, completely false claims. And when I know something to be factually wrong and somebody is just shoving it down people's throats and doing it with like, I don't know, arrogance simultaneously, it's like pretty off-putting, and it feels good to be able to like show the truth of the matter, and then people can decide for themselves what they want to believe or not believe or whatever. And it's also just interesting content sometimes, like dissecting Logan Paul's drink when he, talks shit about other companies and says, oh, it's a better for you drink. Like I'm like, oh my God, I can't help but not just go explode on, the real facts behind, have you even considered XYZ, you idiot? Because it's just somebody who had a product made for them and had no input on the actual process likely of formulating it, and then is speaking as if they're an expert on, electrolyte intake or hydration status in athletes, or talking shit about some of the most established and well-respected companies in the industry to prop up their brand and using misleading marketing around it. Like, it's one thing if you have legitimate claims that you can back with science, or just A versus B, like there's no way you could dispute the way I'm saying something. With him, it would be cherry picking factoids that, like, ignoring a product category that the same company has that's actually their direct competitor, and then, putting their sugar-free product against like the most sugar-dense version of a Gatorade or something, and then claiming their stuff sucks. Don't use Gatorade because ours has no sugar, and look at theirs, it's so unhealthy for you. Like, oh my God, could you think of something more absurd? And he knows that Gatorade's not going to respond because, you don't respond to the person smaller than you is the general kind of, and who would even be the spokesperson for Gatorade to respond to that, right? Like a YouTuber, Gatorade responds to YouTuber, it's just not going to happen. So he knows that he can get away with it. And that's frustrating to me as somebody who makes content around dietary supplements and just sees him lying to the masses.
Do you think these guys believe what they're selling and they just don't know what they're talking about? Or do you think they're kind of like bad people?
I think Logan Paul is genuinely an unethical, shitty person. Yeah.
Have you had any interactions with him after this?
He posted me on his Instagram story and basically just like talked shit about me once. And I'm sure he's talked shit about me behind the scenes as well. But similar to, you don't talk down to the people who have, smaller followings or whatever. I'm sure to that vein, he's heavily restrained, even acknowledging the video's existence. What is funny is AI podcasts that get created. If you see Logan Paul on Joe Rogan AI version, Joe Rogan challenges him on this, and it's just so fucking interesting to watch his response that you would just see how he would try and market his way out of it. I know it's a fake conversation, but it was actually really interesting to listen to. And he, that's almost just a sidebar of just an interesting thing I saw, but I truly think that he does not know the products he sells. I think he's very money oriented. I think he's clout driven. I think that he doesn't really care about the end consumer as much as he claims. Like, there's a bunch of stuff that I don't like the way he operates. And that's aside from the crypto scams and stuff, which, he might defend himself to high hell on some of those crypto things, but like, I think they're indefensible, some of them.
It's always interesting. There's people I'm aware of in business where they basically steal from people on the internet. And it's amazing how stealing from people, if you met a person and like, let's say, you met a guy and then you found out that he went around pickpocketing from old ladies, you'd be like, I'm never hanging out with this guy. In fact, I want him to be like put in the town square and I want to throw tomatoes at him or whatever. And yet when you do it on the internet, it's totally fine. And whatever, it's crazy. You
know what was interesting too is when I had lunch with you, you were like, as much as I can acknowledge that these people are pieces of shit, if they asked me to have a lunch, I would probably still do it.
Well, it's awkward, right? I probably wouldn't have lunch with them, but I really debate this because there's people who I run into. I mean, we're in Vancouver right now. Vancouver, there's a lot of fraud. There's a lot of illegitimate companies and scams and all sorts of stuff. For some reason, there's lots here. And I'll run into these people and I'll do my best to avoid them, but it's very awkward. Like, what am I supposed to do? Spit at their feet? Tell them they're a piece of shit? Like, I just don't know, right? And it's shocking. Charlie Munger puts it really well. He goes, there's always going to be rats in the granary. You just have to accept that, right? And I really struggle with that because I've had experiences with people in business where I want those people to be called out. I think it's very admirable what you're doing. And I think it's awesome you're doing it. But I always debate, am I giving energy to these people? Am I engaging with them? Am I shining a light on them? Have you caught any flack? Has there been any negative consequences of calling these guys out?
Yeah, I suppose. Like, it certainly doesn't help when, Logan Paul blasts you on his story to 23 million people and says, this guy's shitty or whatever. In general, as you grow in following, I think you develop it's impossible to not have some subsect of your audience that just truly follows you because they hate you. And that amount grows over time just by sheer numbers. It's impossible to not. And yeah, like, you'll get haters in the comment section. You'll get people that are calling you out for what they deem to be your own unethical behaviors or whatever. Like, it's part of the game for sure. I don't know. Like, I guess in general, it's been well received overall. And I think that speaks to what people value in transparency at the end of the day. Because there's a lot of stuff that was so avoidable. Like, all these people that are lying through their teeth, they could just say, the Liver King could have been like, I'm on hormones, but you should still eat this way because it helped my family or whatever. My kids had autoimmune issues and they're much better because of this. Follow it if you want. That's what we do, but that's not the only way. Instead of just telling somebody to eat, liver and then you can double their testosterone and not have to use hormones like him or whatever. And then Logan Paul, market your better for you drink without lying about it. Like, it's not that hard, tastes good, has no sugar, high in potassium. A lot of people are deficient in potassium, no sodium. Like, just fucking talk about it. Like, they're so unnecessary to put these. I suppose they're viral, and that's kind of what builds the mass awareness, I suppose, with the bold claims. But it's such a double-edged sword because, in the short term, you can build a really fast hype train, but it could crash just as fast in the short term. And I think it's just baffling to me how many people with mega followings are willing to put it on the line for another $2 million or something. It's like, Logan Paul, you've made content for like 10 years. You don't need a crypto scam. How stupid are you? Like, why would you risk your whole brand on that? Like, there's zero chance him doing it and then also not paying back people instantly was worth the flack he got when he got put on blast. Like, I just don't get it.
Yeah, there's a great YouTuber called CoffeeZilla who basically does what you do, but when you out these people, but regarding crypto scams and stuff, and he did an amazing takedown of Logan Paul, and it's pretty gross. I want to ask you about fame. So you went from this random bouncer to being on Rogan. I'm assuming like you could probably get texts from celebrities being like, how do I get ripped? Like, what has that been like? And you have fame in an interesting way. You have fame in a weird niche of like gym bros, right? Specifically, what is that like? What's that like day to day for you?
It has extended into like the general health sphere. I don't really know when you become like, there's almost like fitness industry as a subsect of health as a whole. And it has bled out a little bit, which is interesting to see it kind of expand into more like Gen Pop. Because typically for the first however many years, it was essentially just, gym bros.
You go to GNC, you're famous. You go anywhere else, no one knows you.
Yeah. So for me, I think it's kind of the sweet spot right now where it's you are able to have a positive impact on people, but it's not so overwhelming that you can't leave your house. So
I was hanging out with Mr. Beast. A friend of mine put on an event with him, and he was talking about how he can't go anywhere, right? Yeah. He said, and the interesting thing about Mr. Beast is, someone like Brad Pitt goes out, or Anthony Hopkins, some great actor, and they go, oh, that's Brad Pitt. That's amazing. Someone sees Mr. Beast and they go, oh my God, maybe he's going to change my life and make me rich today, right? And so people constantly go up to him, and because he's number one on YouTube globally, they translate the videos all over the world. He can't go out anywhere. In Manila, he was telling some story about how people figured out he was at a hotel and like stormed the hotel or whatever. I think that's an extreme level of fame. And I think fortunately he seems like he's built for it and he's down for that. But for you, how often are you getting recognized? And at what point would that be too much? At what point would that start having a negative effect on your life?
In general, if I leave the house and go to a restaurant, if I go to the gym, it's guaranteed essentially. If I go to a restaurant or just out with my girlfriend or whatever, typically one or two people in the span of, I guess it depends, but it'll at least once an outing typically, which to me is like totally reasonable to like, it's still cool and it's nice to meet people who I've had a positive impact on, and it doesn't feel overwhelming at all. Where the threshold is of, okay, it's a little bit absurd, I don't really know. But like, I've seen what Joe has to deal with. Mr. Beast sounds insane as well. A-list celebs.
But when I met you a year ago, you said no one ever comes up to you and you're totally anonymous. So if you think about the trajectory, a year ago, you're like, yeah, I think you said you're like, yeah, at the gym once in a while. But if it's now, it's like every time you go out. It's like when you project that forward, let's say it's like you're trying to have dinner, you're arguing with your girlfriend about something, and some guy comes over, and then another one, and then another one. It's interesting how like fame is such a double-edged sword. And there really is, you're in this Goldilocks stage right now. I was just talking to Ali Abdal. Do you know him?
Yeah.
He's a great guy, productivity YouTuber, and he was saying he's getting recognized 6 times a day. Yeah. And he's like, if it gets more than that, it's really going to be negative.
Where and how much?
In London. Out? He said if he wears his I think it's like if he doesn't wear his glasses, he's anonymous. But if he does, everyone notices him or whatever. It's very interesting. What about money? So, you've got this big business. It's still private. You mentioned you're reinvesting a lot into it, but what are you doing with your money? What are you doing with your profits? Are you investing them, or how are you managing your personal money?
Yeah. So it's a bit complicated.
Well, that's kind of how we met, right?
Yeah. So the way Canadian corps work is different than the States, where a lot of US entrepreneurs, it almost is unrelatable somewhat to talk about. I don't even know how. This is why I consume a lot of your stuff in particular, because it's like the only financial corporate structure that is like somewhat analogous to my own. In Canada, you don't have flow through entities. It all behaves like a C Corp in Canada, essentially. If you were to compare the most comparable thing in the state structure wise, a lot of people, when they start businesses, they start an LLC, which you're on the hook personally for all flow through taxable income. And there's no retained earnings to strategize around the profits of. It's simply you distribute the amount to cover your taxes, or you pay it out of pocket and deal with it. Or if you're a Canadian, the way that it works is you make money in your corp, you pay corporate tax, and then you decide with those profits, do you want to do a dividend to yourself and pay more tax, or leave it in the company and reinvest accordingly? For me, a lot of it has been reinvesting via the corporate entities into further growth and or new opportunities, as opposed to like, I don't really pay myself a whole lot, which I don't know if you could relate or speak to, I'm sure we'll get into it in my podcast with you, but yeah, I don't really pay myself a whole lot of anything. So
you're rich on paper, and you're rich you're technically rich. You've got a bunch of money in the bank, but you don't access it.
Essentially, yeah. And I don't take out lines of credit against my assets. I don't understand it enough yet to be comfortable with it yet. although I will ask you in quite detail how that works in our podcast. But yeah, to date, I have paid myself like a meager salary proportional to what, you might otherwise think 100 million plus, company is doing. So yeah, it's largely been, and some of this stuff is capital intensive, to expand a e-coms brand that has physical products with warehouse and fulfillment and exploding cans in transit and melting protein bars going across the country. Like there's a lot that goes into reinvestment that is not just, typically the profits are going to be used to buy more inventory or get more help and staff or whatever. So
Well, it's an extremely hard business, and it's interesting. It's a business I would say never get into. But what your advantage is if you think about most e-com companies, if they spend $1 overall, 30 cents of that has to go into marketing, and your company just doesn't have to do marketing. So you actually have margin, whereas every other beverage company, supplement company has these razor thin margins that are terrible. Have you considered doing like digital products and stuff, or are you just like avoiding that? You're only focused on stuff that you're consuming and making? Like,
the problem is the bandwidth suck. I know that in the time it would take me to do a course, for example, that would be pure profit once it's created, I could have micro pieced that out into free pieces of content that otherwise elevated the businesses as a whole, probably dramatically more than whatever short-term upside I get in, a big payday of a giant course that I also then have to rationalize like why I'm, selling a $1,000 digital thing, which is seen at least perhaps unjustifiably, because sometimes they're legit products and services. It's seen as like a cash grab nowadays. And I just don't necessarily think the time investment makes sense on the ROI for it when I could otherwise just make the content for free, which people would appreciate. And then also it just brings awareness to the existing companies should they want to support me and or get access to those products. You have the choice to do so. But I'm not constantly trying to funnel people, which I don't like content like that, where it's like, I'm going to give you the answer, but wait, I'm actually not. Buy the course. It's like, fuck you. I just sat through 7 minutes. Tell me the answer. So I don't want to do that stuff. So I had considered it just to make, because I know some people want to just have the answer consolidated into a framework. If you had, for example, hair loss prevention, I might have.
I texted you. I text you this. I'll be like, dude, what do I do? What do I take? Who do I talk to?
Yeah, because it's, even though it could be, it may otherwise be seen as basic. There absolutely is a case to be made that if there was a, all-in-one, step-by-step, here's how you assess your scalp health, here's how you assess your hormones to see if you're going to be prone to side effects if you use a finasteride related product. Here are the medications that actually work and the ones that don't and why. There's obviously a case to be made having that in like a step-by-step format rather than having people jump around in videos. I have a playlist, but it's still not going to be chronological in the sequence of things. So there's a case to be made for it, but it's still like, I feel like by the time I made the course, I would probably say, man, these videos would just be better as videos.
And then it's also like you look at Huberman, he just creates those PDF checklists, put them up for free. You're probably so much better off, to your point, just growing the audience over and over again.
Yeah. It's, the course thing is tough because I definitely see that's one of the best ways somebody could get a maximally profit driven thing out there as a creator. Because
the profits are, there's people, I can't go into detail, but I know of various creators who have software products and you can run 80% margins. And so you can do 10 million of revenue, $8 million of profit, whereas you might have to do $200 million to make $8 million of profit, right? And so it's business on easy mode versus business on hard mode. And that's the advantage of that. But ultimately, can you do it in an authentic way that doesn't piss off your audience, all that stuff? It's hard.
Yeah, like I think I think I could. I just, as of now, it hasn't made sense yet. And I'm not saying it wouldn't, because I would have liked that product, for example, when I started learning about anything when it comes to hormones, hair loss, self-improvement stuff. It would have been nice. And I would pay for that. But yeah. The bandwidth is just like, it's not there. So
you spend all your time making content, running your business. The byproduct of that is money. You don't access the money. Do you enjoy the money? Is there anything, are you getting a sense of security and you're enjoying that? Or are you buying cars? Are you buying a house? Are you doing anything with the money to enjoy it?
I fly first class, which is nice. I will rent nice studios for podcasts. I don't know, like it depends, because a lot of the building is the enjoyment. And that's kind of a half-baked, like, cop-out answer, because obviously you still want to make money for your time investment. And I guess fortunately for me, the businesses that I'm in, they're things that are so interesting to me that the reward of building them is actually rewarding despite not cashing out. And the fringe upside is, as a content creator, there's ways you can generate income separate to the businesses entirely. So the businesses do not fund my lifestyle. Like, I could have them never pay me and I would be fine via, YouTube / whatever it is. Even like existing Amazon links from 2016 still will pull in, random. I'll get like a couple $1,000 a month still, which is pretty good, for something that's passive entirely. So it's tough though, because there definitely is a point where you start to calculate, does this make sense anymore when, capital gains rates are going to the moon and it's less and less favorable to have a business? It's like, what are you even doing this for again?
Well, forgetting the tax stuff, I think if you love doing it, that's great. But from my experience, I found that, it's like cooking delicious food, right? You cook all this great food and then you fill your belly, then you feed your family, feed some people around you care about. But then it's like, well, what am I going to do with all this food? And it's not like it expires. You can put it in the bank and you can do other things with it. But ultimately, you got to find something meaningful to do. And some people go and buy Fabergé eggs and sports car collections and yachts, and, other people sit on it. Other people give it to their kids. Like, have you thought about that at all? Because, it's easy when you're building a business to forget about this stuff. But when you own multiple businesses and you're doing hundreds of millions of dollars of revenue, that you're probably on paper worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Have you thought about that at all?
So that's the funny thing, is how are you? It's like you could be worth hundreds of millions of dollars if you liquidated with no tax.
Sure. Well, right? But forget tax. The government, you got to remember, the government is a 25% equity owner of any business you start in the United States or Canada. That's just, it is what it is, right?
Yeah. I guess I did sort of not answer your question too about what I do with the money I have. So maybe I circle back to that first. T-bills primarily, S&P 500, and redeploying when appropriate for new opportunities, angel investing minorly, and some crypto, essentially.
Careful with the angel investing.
Yeah, I don't do a lot of it.
Yeah, it's so easy to buy a bunch of lottery tickets.
Yeah. So, yeah, in general, it's not like I do nothing with it. One thing I can say that I wouldn't do, and I've learned, and you could attest to this too, is wealth management. Stay the fuck away from those people. That was one of the biggest mistakes I made with my money early on. They will boast some fancy presentation about how they'll beat the S&P 500. They don't. And they will try and, explain their way around it. And, we're saving the losses. Like, you're still fucking losing money.
My friend, Moise Elliott, I don't know if you heard it, but he went on My First Million. He's the guy who did native deodorant. Okay. And he made a ton of money. He sold it in 2 years for $100 million. And he said that he gave some of his money to, I think it was like Goldman Sachs or some wealth management firm. And his example was, he said basically, like, they'll do anything that is fee bearing for them. Whatever they make the most money from, they'll tell you is a good idea. And he goes, I could go to them and say, Bill Gates has agreed to buy this pen for $1 billion. Here's a binding contract that's rock solid. Should I do this? And they'd say, no, you should go into our private equity fund. Yeah. Right? Like, it's just it's ridiculous.
Yeah. So, like, one thing I have found that segregates, and perhaps this is like a hack for people who are new to millionaire status, is do not do wealth management. Because typically I find that when you first get into money, that's one of the things people think you should do. You need somebody managing your money. You need a team.
You got to have a guy.
Yeah. And it's like, in reality, the team is taking advantage of your naivety and claiming that, this is what all the wealthy people do. this is the way to go. Welcome to the big leagues. In reality, they're just
buying stocks and bonds.
And just squeezing you for 1% of the portfolio, if not more.
Which doesn't sound like much, but when you think about it over 20, 30 years, I mean, it's millions of dollars. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's like, it almost never works in my experience.
So just going deeper, a level deeper then. So what are you going to do with all this money? Have you contemplated that?
I think similar to you, I suppose, like looking for new ways to deploy it that I find interesting enough to not necessarily suck bandwidth, because I certainly don't have any more of that to give, but just like have in the portfolio things that are interesting to diversify and or things I think I can add significant value to as Derek. It's just in my lane essentially. So you look for particular companies for Tiny that you guys know you can have a big impact on. I would be similar in that vein, just for different niches of products, likely.
So buying businesses?
Yeah, probably. Because I certainly don't have the bandwidth to start many new ones. Yeah. As attractive as some of them are, and I have, ideas and whatnot, it's like, the problem is I am not able to segregate myself yet away from the product development process, because I'm the science guy for supplements or pharmacology or whatever. People defer to me for like highly detailed, elaborate information on that stuff. So to entrust a like quote unquote formulator or somebody else to do the product dev, it often is not something I can delegate. So in Gorilla Mind in particular, I'm literally doing everything product dev related, minus the logistical hurdles to actually get, the instructions out to them, communicating with them back and forth, getting shipments sent, getting samples made, whatever. Like, I don't do that, but I will still be step by step. Here's the formula. Here's the exact milligrams of this. Here's what we need. I need to taste test this. I'm literally putting my nose on every fragrance, tasting every single flavor we make of energy drink. The formulas are all me. No one's doing it for me. So that is very time intensive as the catalogs expand. And at this point, it's beyond a full-time job just to sustain with the current SKUs we have, let alone expand further. So it's hard for me to imagine doing more unless I had somebody who is absurdly qualified to where I could be like, you're better than me at this. And that person's hard to find when you're typically the go-to content creator for something that is otherwise a very narrow niche.
Yeah, I think I kind of go in and out of the same thing. Like, we have 40 companies now. And the way I look at it is like, we've built the machine. And then my role is really to market, to talk about what we do. And then everything, all that interest or whatever it is, people wanting to sell their businesses or do business with us or whatever, goes into that machine, and then money gets spat out the other end. And there's always stuff breaking down. There's always stuff going out that I don't like. There's always, a press release I need to edit, or just yesterday we had someone sent an offer on a business, and the way they wrote it was just terrible. Right? Like they buried the lead in it. And so I find the same thing. I get totally pulled into it day to day. And I don't know that it's possible to get out of that. And I think your integrity really shines through in your videos. And I've bought all your products. I use your hair products and your fragrances and everything. I'm about to try your microneedling pen, but I'm a bit scared. It looks a bit pokey. I think that shines through, and it's you got to be really careful.
Yeah. Yeah. It's tough, man. 'Cause I also would be very cautious to put out marketing behind stuff I haven't actually created myself. Whereas people like Logan Paul and whatnot, I feel like in some ways blessed in that they can totally remove themselves from the ideation process and just be a face of the company. And it allows them to do what they do best, marketing. But the problem is when you're also the entrepreneur and you started these businesses too, there's huge emotional tie to the product, the way it's created. And it's not just a matter of you need to go hands off and just let people do their job. Like, there's literally nobody that I could just plug in and be like, make pre-workouts the same way I do, or, taste something with Derek's ton.
So I asked you before this to make a list of a couple books and products that you've loved lately. So let's start with books. What have you been reading? It could be content or movies or anything. What have you loved lately? What struck you?
So, preface, I'm not a reader. So, your book was, besides Peter's book, Peter Attia, I haven't read any books for years probably. So, I would say your book's called Never Enough, right? And that was very good. So, when it comes out, when's it coming out, by the way?
I think July 6th.
Oh, nice. Okay. So, I like that and I could relate to a lot of it. So, I would recommend that. I literally just read it. Peter Attia's book, Outlive, it's his essentially culmination of expertise on trying to make a practical guide to longevity, vitality, and just general, optimization of life/health. Really recommend that book as well. As well as his membership only podcast, The Drive. That's probably of the science-based content, the thing I consume the most of. So if you're looking to educate yourself for stuff that's not as exotic, because my channel sometimes will talk about things that are, PED related, performance enhancing drugs or hormones. That stuff is, Peter doesn't talk about that stuff, but he will talk about like everything to do with general health, vitality, quote unquote anti-aging. He doesn't like that term, but it's like what a lot of people would also qualify some of his stuff as. If you were to go down that road, this is the best content for achieving an outcome as close to that as possible.
I just feel like it's like doctors talking to doctors, and you get to listen in, and you kind of have to like decode the words they're using. And if you listen long enough, you learn what they all mean. But it's I agree, it's some of the best medical information on the internet.
And the thing that makes his content so good, in my opinion, is not only that he will pick somebody he deems as the foremost expert in that field to bring on. And it's not always the case. Like he's had me on. I'm certainly not like the foremost expert and like whatever, but often he will have the foremost expert in fill in the blank area of medicine or whatever, who's on the cutting edge. And his interpretation of who is the top expert is second to none. And he knows the questions to ask them to get really deep on things that no other person could do, because he has such a general but also deep knowledge of many different areas of health and longevity, pharmacology, diagnostics, etc. Like he's the guy to really get the most out of these podcasts. And it's even to the detriment of views. Like there's no real care taken to the virality of it, which is great because the quality of information is so on point. It is valued much more than the capitalizing on the clickbait title with somebody he knows would get more views.
It can be boring and long and detailed, and it goes really deep. I want to second also your recommendation of Peter's book, because it is like the ultimate encyclopedia of everything he knows and how to enhance your longevity and health and stuff. But the way it's written is so memorable. That last chapter, holy shit. I mean, Peter, I won't ruin it for anybody who's gonna read the book, but oh my God, like he really opens up and goes deep on himself, and it's really beautifully written. So yeah, I'd recommend that to anybody.
Yeah, and you wouldn't expect typically from like science-based creators or doctors to start talking about emotional health, but he covers mental, emotional health in like great depth, happiness, things that you wouldn't even think of necessarily optimizing for, but are very important as well. Yeah.
What about products? So products, services, this could be, for me, it's like, I love my Leica camera. I love my Dyson fan, or software you use. Is there anything you'd recommend to the audience?
I think private banking is pretty helpful.
Second that.
Yeah. So the efficiency for any entrepreneur who is considering if private banking is worth it, as long as the bank you're working with and the banker you're working with is solid, it will make your life a whole lot easier. Not having to go to the bank for wire transfers.
Who do you use in Canada?
Being 8 Sleep, absurd piece of sleep tech that is second to none, in my opinion. Me and my girlfriend love it.
I have, I'm tall, I'm 6'3", and so I ended up getting a bed made that was a little like extra large, extra wide, a custom made bed. And so it doesn't fit, but I'm debating. I just got a text actually from Mateo, the founder, saying, "Hey, I want to send you one." And so I'm like, fuck, can I cut this thing into the size? But you find it's really worth it because I have AC in my house. I blast the AC.
Not the same.
No.
And I'm sure your girlfriend doesn't love your temperature.
No, we sleep, we have our own duvets.
So this is the thing, is you don't need that with the 8 sleep. It just separates with a virtual line in the middle. So you could actually like physically touch each other if you wanted to and not have this weird segregation of mattresses.
So you really notice a distinct, let's say you're not in the bed, because I get it. You're sleeping with a partner, they're hot, all that kind of stuff. But if you're alone in the bed, you have AC in a hotel or something like that, it's really enhancing your deep sleep, or what are you noticing?
Yeah. So when you blast AC, you're going to have your face exposed, maybe your hands, it depends. And sometimes your legs will get hot, but then you'll be like cold up here. And it's just like not an even distribution of optimization. And you have to really, the room doesn't auto regulate. You set it to what you think is going to be your best temperature. And then you cross your fingers and you might look at your, wearable the next day to see if it was good or not. But this thing learns as you go. So throughout the night, it will auto-regulate your temperature based on what you need at the time. And considerate of the fact that if you eat a huge meal, you go with your friends or whatever, like your temperature is going to be different in terms of requirements to get to sleep faster, stay asleep.
So it knows your temperature.
Yeah, it will like auto-regulate based on what you need. And it splits down the middle. So then your girlfriend, who definitely has different needs than you, will not have to deal with your Arctic cold bed.
So what do you notice? Because my problem is like, it's not really a problem. I sleep great. I get like a 90 plus or a score every night. I sleep really well, but I still have wake ups and, little stuff like that. What have you noticed that's distinctly different if you have let's say you have a good sleep in a hotel, or you have a good sleep before you got the 8 sleep versus now? What are those key differences?
I fall asleep very quickly, so it's hard for me to say that my latency is better because I just fall asleep quickly, essentially regardless, unless the environment is brutal. But in general, I feel more refreshed after using it for the same amount of time in bed. And the way it wakes you up is really great. So typically what I would do is I would have an alarm in my bathroom and it would force me to get up to go turn it off. Whereas the 8 sleep and that also wakes up my girlfriend.
Why do you have an alarm at all though?
Because I like to have a routine and my sleep schedule is relatively variable. So despite the fact that, you should just be in bed for 8 hours and wake up naturally, doesn't work for me like that.
One of the best things I ever did was I noticed with my son when he was a baby, if I just stuck to a crazy rigorous schedule, then he would sleep amazing. And so I started doing it too. And now I go to bed within a 15-minute window every night. I literally read and I look at my Kindle, and at an exact time, I almost always turn it off and pass out. And it's made my sleep so much better. I really recommend trying to get into that window, because then I wake up at the exact same time, go to sleep at the exact same time, no alarm.
Yeah, there's definitely ways. I'm certainly not suggesting that everyone needs this thing, by the way. So just put it out there. It's like a very expensive device and I use it. I think it's great, but it's not necessary to get a good night's sleep. And I had good night's sleeps before it too. It just makes it a lot more pleasant now. And, for me, I don't have a perfect rigorous schedule. Often I'm going to bed at 3 hours later than the night before. Sometimes I'm up late proofreading something. Now that I'm back to essentially daily videos, I'm going to be even more variable probably because my editors are in different time zones. So for me, the wake up feature where it warms you up and or vibrates you awake, depending on your preference, is so much better than your alarm blasting in the other room.
The cheap version of this, interesting. I was talking to Dr. Ashley Mason, who is a expert in sleep at UCSF, and she said the number one. She worked in the insomnia clinic for a long time, and she said the number one piece of advice she would give people is just to switch from a duvet to a cotton blanket. Those kind of woven cotton blankets, and just have 2 of them. And I started doing this. So I now sleep with 2 cotton blankets, and I just peel one off if I get too hot, and it's totally changed my sleep. I think most people sleep way too hot in general. And I know that you have to lower your body temperature to fall asleep. You have to keep it low to stay asleep, and then you have to warm up to wake up, right? So I think there's something here, and you can get the cheap version or the like $2,000 crazy bed version.
I think the viability definitely goes up if you sleep with a partner in your bed, because
Oh yeah.
typically I think you can replicate probably manually very close to the ideal environment temperature wise via AC and, other cheaper things. But it's, at least in my experience, pretty much every girl I've dated runs way colder than me. So like they're freezing their ass off when I am very hot even. And then if I have the room freezing, so I feel good, like they're literally in multiple layers and dying. So having that segregated down the middle where they have their own temperature regulation happening and their own stats being recorded and all that stuff and their own wake up feature with alarm and whatever, it's quite nice. And
Sweet.
yeah.
What else?
I have it's like a timer, which is like, everyone knows what a timer is, but I just bought a cheap timer off Amazon and I keep it in front of my desk, on my desk, right in front of me within like eyesight all day essentially. And it gives me a sense of urgency on my task list. So for me, I operate far better under pressure, not necessarily higher quality, but more like I actually get work done, don't procrastinate. So I'm sure a lot of people can relate to when you had a project due in school or you have a final exam or whatever, all of a sudden you become hyper efficient the last couple days because you have no choice.
So you doing Pomodoro where you say, I'm going to do this for 30 minutes and then take a break? Or are you saying I have a 4-hour window to do work and it's just counting down?
For me, I have a task list segregated by time of day, and it's like pretty meticulously written out where it's like from 12 o'clock to 1:30, you should be doing this and you should be done this task by 1:30. If you are efficient by my standard of what I have seen historically, I'm able to do that task in if I was not distracted. And then having the timer in front of me, it's like holding you accountable to the deadline because your task list is often not glaring you in the face while you're working. And some people might hate this. I'm not saying it's for everyone, but for me, having like a ticking timer that's like, you're a piece of shit if you don't get this done, it works well, or at least better for me. Because once you miss your first deadline of the day, it starts to snowball because now it's like, oh my God, I have to somehow do that task now in half the time I had, and it's bleeding into the next block that you have something else you're supposed to be doing. And then before you know it, you blew your whole day. So it's very easy to get sidetracked. The problem with being a creator online is you get sucked down the rabbit hole of like attention grabbing content and things that steal your attention. But you also need to be on it to be posting stuff, getting feedback, even communicating with creators and or viewing your businesses operating because you post daily on those too. And before you know it, you burn 25 minutes on the toilet watching, Instagram reels. It's like, fuck, having something keeping you accountable is pretty key, I think.
Which is also weirdly your job, right? You got to know about that stuff, but then not get pulled down the rabbit hole. Is there any other weird productivity stuff that you do?
I have a death clock as well.
I do that as well.
Yeah.
I had it for a while. It was every time I'd open a new tab on my browser, I'd see how many weeks I have left.
Oh yeah. Yeah. So that's the only issue with this stuff though is oftentimes if you don't take it seriously, you'll get accustomed to it just being there. So like there was a point where I had like a phone background that was like yelling at me, alarms that would go off every 20 minutes yelling at me. I'd have the timer, have a death clock going. Yeah. It's like all this shit that's just like, you suck. And it almost like reinforces a negative mindset.
Well, or you adapt to it. Like I had this.
Yeah, it just becomes your new normal and you're like, oh, death clock.
Every parent's worst fear is you leave your baby in the back. You forget your baby's in there or whatever, leave him in a hot car or something like that. And so I put a red sticker so I'd never forget on there, and you just start seeing the red sticker and you don't even pay attention. Fortunately, I never left my son in the hot car, but you just get used to anything.
Oh yeah.
Normal.
Yeah. Having a timer going in front of you. There are many times I catch myself just resetting it just because it went off, not because it was actually holding me accountable. And I have to actively remind myself. It's very difficult to actually, when you're an entrepreneur, you don't have somebody breathing down your neck to tell you to work. So you almost have to be your own boss, which can get problematic at times because no one's going to scold you for not working unless you do it to yourself. And even if you do it to yourself, I don't know if that's necessarily the best mindset either.
I have a friend, Todd, and he always does weird stuff like this, but he got a bracelet and it's called the Pavlok. And it is a little rubberized bracelet with 2 contacts on it and a battery. and it Bluetooths to your phone. And if you don't do something within the window you say you're going to do it, it literally electrocutes you. And if you continue not to do it, it zaps you harder and harder over time. I tried it and I was like, oh my God, this is like a dog collar or something. It's crazy.
My God.
Yeah. Maybe try that.
Yeah. It's funny because I'm laughing at that as if it's absurd, but at one point I had considered hiring somebody who just like sits in my house and just like
productivity dominatrix.
Yeah. Just like, are you fucking working? What are you doing?
Yeah.
Your office is over there.
That's so funny.
Yeah. So
sweet. Well, dude, this was so fun. It's always great to see you. And I appreciate you coming on.
Awesome. Well, thank you for having me.
Yeah, of course, dude.